World War II Origins and Operation Barbarossa. Welcome to a compelling exploration of the intricate tapestry that led to the monumental events of World War II and the pivotal Operation Barbarossa. In this documentary, we embark on a journey to uncover the origins of the conflict that engulfed the world in chaos and the dramatic campaign that reshaped the Eastern Front. By delving into the historical, political, and ideological forces that converge, we aim to provide a nuanced understanding of the circumstances that gave rise to both the global conflagration and the audacious military maneuver that forever altered the course of the war. Join us as we navigate through the complex web of alliances, ambitions, and decisions that ultimately led to the dramatic turning points of the 20th century. Origins of the Second World War. There have been many academic works and books about the origins of World War II. Generally, the authors claim the war was started by the expansionist aims of Nazi policy. In this documentary, I will try to make the case that the topic of the origins of the World War deserves a scrutinized analysis, one that does not square the blame solely on one Hitler. You may call me a Nazi sympathizer or a wereaboo. It is of no concern to me. My aim is to articulate a nuanced and impartial understanding of the Second World War's origins. Below is an examination of German and Polish war aims in the prelude to WW2. To understand how the war in 1939 between Poland and Germany, and consequently WW2, unfolded, it is not sufficient to look at and accept the widely held view that peace-loving and weak little Poland was attacked by an ever-marauding National Socialist Germany. Rather, one must look much deeper into history. The conflict did not originate with the German invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, as is still claimed. It is not just a black and white story, but a complex and nuanced one. It was also not caused by the Polish mobilization of her army 2 days previous, on August 30, 1939. Although the mobilization of a country's army, according to international standards, is equal to a declaration of war on the neighboring country. On the 30th of August 1939, Marshal Smigly put the country on war footing. The Navy was instructed to activate Operation Pekin. The destroyer flotilla left for Britain and had time to clear the Danish Straits before war was declared. German-Polish relations are even today poisoned by centuries-old, deep-seated hatred on the Polish side. For centuries, the Poles have been taught from early childhood on that Germans were evil and ought to be fought whenever there was a promise of success. Hate on such a scale, as it was and still is promoted in Poland today against her westerly neighbor, eventually leads to a chauvinism that knows few constraints. In Poland, as in all countries, the respective elites use the means accessible to them to shape public sentiment. Traditionally, these elites have been the Polish Catholic Church, writers, intellectuals, politicians, and the press. For a balanced understanding of the forces which moved Poland inexorably ever closer to the war against Germany, it is essential to investigate the role these components of the Polish society have played in the past. And it is fairly easy to find abundant evidence for the above claim and to trace it from the present time back into the distant past. It is not difficult to imagine how this perversion of civilized human conduct eventually must lead to an authoritarian mentality that was also present in the Polish media. They did not mince words when it came to arousing public fanaticism without restrictions when it was time to go to war against Germany. They were the ultimate instrument for instilling in the public the view that Poland was the peerless power that would chasten Germany by defeating her in a few days. Characteristic of this was, for example, an oil painting that showed Marshal Smigly, the Polish commander-in-chief, riding on horseback through the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. 14. This painting was found by German troops in the presidential palace in Warsaw and was not even completely dry. When war finally came, the Germans in Polish territory suffered terribly. They had to bear the unspeakable hate of the Poles. Some 35,000 of them were murdered, often under the most bestial circumstances. Dr. Kurt Luck writes on page 271, Poles had thrown dead dogs into many of the graves of murdered ethnic Germans. Near Neustadt in West Prussia, the Poles slashed open the belly of a captured German officer, tore out his intestines, and stuffed a dead dog inside. This report is reliably documented, and a German mother grieves for her sons. She writes on October 12, 1939, "Oh, but that our dear boys had to die such terrible deaths. 12 people were lying in a ditch, and all of them had been cruelly beaten to death. Eyes gouged out, skulls smashed, heads split open, teeth knocked out. Little Carl had a hole in his head, probably from a stabbing implement. Little Paul had the flesh torn off his arms, and all this while they were still alive. Now they rest in a mass grave of more than 40, free at last of their terror and pain. They have peace now, but I never shall." And between 1919 and 1921 to 400, zero ethnic Germans fled their homes and crossed the German border in order to save their lives. What can one say of the hate that speaks from the pages of one of the more popular papers, the largest Polish newspaper Illustroni Codziennie, which appeared on April 20, 1929, in Krakow? Away with the Germans behind their natural border. Let's get rid of them behind the Oder. Silesian Apeln is Polish to the core, just as all of Silesia and all of Pomerania were Polish before the German onslaught. There will be no peace in Europe until all Polish lands shall have been restored completely to Poland, until the name Prussia, being that of a people long since gone, shall have been wiped from the map of Europe, and until the Germans have moved their capital Berlin farther westwards. 19. On October 1923, Stanislaus Grabski, who later was to become Minister of Public Worship and Instruction, announced, "We want to base our relations on love, but there is one kind of love for one's own people and another kind for strangers. Their percentage is decidedly too high here. Posen can show us one way to reduce that percentage from 14% or even 20% to 0.5%. The foreign element will have to see if it would not be better off elsewhere." Are intelligent enough to realize that in the event of war, no enemy on Polish soil will get away alive. The Fuhrer is far away, but the Polish soldiers are close, and in the woods there is no shortage of branches. 21. We are ready to make a pact with the devil if he will help us in the battle against Germany. Here, against Germany, not just against Hitler. In an upcoming war, German blood will be spilled in rivers such as all of world history has never seen before. 22. Poland's decision of August 30, 1939, that was the basis for general mobilization, marked a turning point in the history of Europe. It forced Hitler to wage war at a time when he hoped to gain further on bloody victories. 23. Heinz Splitgerberg, in his short book Unkenntnis oder Infamy, quotes a number of Polish sources which reflect the atmosphere in Poland immediately before the hostilities commenced. On August 7, 1939, the Illustroni Courier featured an article which described with provocative effrontery how military units were continually foraying across the border into German territory in order to destroy military installations and to take weapons and tools of the German Wehrmacht back to Poland. Most Polish diplomats and politicians understood that Poland's actions would perforce lead to war. Foreign Minister Beck tenaciously pursued the bloodthirsty plan of plunging Europe into another great war, since it would presumably result in territorial gains for Poland. 24. He goes on to cite some 14 incidents where Polish soldiers aggressively crossed the border, destroying houses, shooting and killing German farmers and customs officers. One of them, August 29th, state police offices in Elbing, Koslin, and Breslau, main customs office in Buthen and Glewitz. Polish soldiers invade Reich German territory, attack against German customs house, shots taken at German customs officials, Polish machine guns stationed on Reich German territory. 25. These and many more are the things one must take into account before making the fallacious accusation that Germany was the one to have started WW2. The following quotations are added here to show that not only Poland was bent on war against Germany, but also her ally Great Britain. Although it is still widely believed that Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain on September 29, 1938 honestly tried for peace, one has to consider the possibility that his real goals were somewhat different. Only 5 months later, on February 22, 1939, he let the cat out of the bag when he said in Blackburn, "During the past 2 days we have discussed the progress of our arms build-up. The figures are indeed overwhelming, perhaps even to such an extent that the people are no longer able even to comprehend them. Ships, cannons, planes, and ammunition are now pouring out of our dockyards and factories in an ever-increasing torrent." Point 26. Max Kluver writes, "Of the considerable body of evidence that gives cause to doubt whether Chamberlain actually wanted peace, one noteworthy item is a conversation between Chamberlain's chief advisor Wilson and Göring's colleague Wolfat. When Wolfat, taking his leave, again stressed his conviction that Hitler did not want war, Wilson's answer was indicative of the fundamental British attitude that could not be a basis for negotiations between equals. I said that I was not surprised to hear him say that, as I had thought myself, that Hitler cannot have overlooked the tremendous increases which we have made in our defensive and offensive preparations, including, for instance, the very large increase in our Air Force." 27. And on April 27, 1939, England mobilized her armed forces. tumultuous. Heinz Splitgeber quotes Dirk Bavendam, Roosevelt's Weg zum Krieg, who writes, since England had never yet introduced universal conscription during peacetime, this alone virtually amounted to a declaration of war against Germany. From 1935 to 1939, England's annual expenditure on war materials had increased more than fivefold. 28. In 1992 and 1993, Max Kluver, another German historian, spent 5 weeks in the Public Record Office in London searching through documents which, after 50 years of being hidden from public scrutiny, were now open to researchers. He writes in his book Is war nicht Hitler's Krieg, how little the British cared about Danzig and the allegedly endangered Polish independence is also shown by the following brief prepared for Colonel Beck's visit of April 3rd. The brief states, Danzig is an artificial structure, the maintenance of which is a bad casus belli. But it is unlikely that the Germans would accept less than a total solution of the Danzig question except for a substantial quid pro quo which could hardly be less than a guarantee of Poland's neutrality. But such a deal would be a bad bargain for England. It would shake Polish morale, increase their vulnerability to German penetration, and so defeat the policy of forming a bloc against German expansion. It should not therefore be to our interest to suggest that the Poles abandon their rights in Danzig on the ground that they are not defensible. 29. Kluver concludes, so there we have it clearly stated, in the own British interest, the matter of Danzig must not be solved and peace preserved. The British guarantee to Poland, however, had reinforced the Polish in their stubbornness and made them completely obdurate where any solution to the Danzig question was concerned. 30. The American professor Drive Burton Klein, a Jewish economist, wrote in his book Germany's Economic Preparations for War, Germany produced butter as well as cannons, and much more butter and much fewer cannons than was generally assumed. 31. And again, the overall state of the German war economy was not that of a nation geared towards total war, but rather that of a national economy mobilized at first only for small and locally restricted wars, and which only later succumbed to the pressure of military necessity after it had become an incontrovertible fact. For instance, in the fall of 1939, the German preparations for provision with steel, oil, and other important raw materials were anything but adequate for an intense engagement with the great powers. 32. One only has to compare Mr. Klein's observations with what Mr. Bavendam wrote about the British preparations for a major war at the same time, and the blurred picture that is painted by historians becomes much more transparent. The Germans were not the ones to provoke WW2. Besides Chamberlain, there were others in influential and powerful positions in England who were much more outspoken about their wishes. Winston Churchill, for instance, said before the House of Commons on October 5, 1938, "But there can never be friendship between the British democracy and the Nazi power, that power which spurns Christian ethic, which cheers its onwards course by a barbarous paganism, which vaunts the spirit of aggression and conquest, which derives strength and perverted pleasure from persecution, and uses, as we have seen, with pitiless brutality the threat of murderous force." 33. Hitler, of course, knew this very well. In Saarbrücken, on October 9, 1938, he said, "All it would take would be for Mr. Duff Cooper or Mr. Eden or Mr. Churchill to come to power in England instead of Chamberlain." And we know very well that it would be the goal of these men to immediately start a new world war. They do not even try to disguise their intents, they state them openly. As we all know, the British government under Chamberlain gave Poland the guarantee that England would come to its aid if Poland should be attacked. This was on March 31, 1939. Its purpose was to incite Poland to escalate its endeavors for war against Germany. It happened as planned. England declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939, but not on the Soviet Union, who also attacked Poland. And this is proof enough that it was England's intention in the first place to make war on Germany. Thus, WW2 was arranged by a complicity between Britain and Poland. It was not Hitler's war, it was England's and Poland's war. The Poles were merely the stooges. Some of them knew it too. Jules Lukasiewicz, the Polish ambassador to Paris, for instance, who on March 29, 1939 told his foreign minister in Warsaw, "It is childishly naive and also unfair to suggest to a nation in a position like Poland to compromise its relations with such a strong neighbor as Germany and to expose the world to the catastrophe of war for no other reason than to pander to the wishes of Chamberlain's domestic policies." It would be even more naive to assume that the Polish government did not understand the true purpose of this maneuver and its consequences. 60 years have passed since Poland got her wish. Germany lost large additional areas to Poland. Today, these regions can hardly be compared to what they originally were. Houses, farms, the infrastructure, agriculture, even the dikes of the Oder River are decaying. Financial help from Germany goes to Poland as if nothing had happened between the two countries. The 2 million Germans still remaining in Poland are largely forgotten by their brothers in the West. They now suffer the same fate as other Germans did in Poland in earlier times. In earlier times, the aim was already to eradicate all things German. For instance, in the 18th century, the Catholic Germans from Bamberg who had followed their bishop and immigrated to Poland after the plague were forcibly Polonized. They were denied German church services, German confession, and the German catechism, and were re-educated to become Poles. By the time of the First World War, these Germans from Bamberg had become so thoroughly Polonized that despite their traditional Bamberg costumes, which they still wore and for which they were still called Bambergi, they could no longer speak German. 36. Not only is today's German minority in Poland in danger of losing its identity, the same happened even to famous Germans of the past. Wetzstoß, who was born in Nuremberg and died there too, is now called Wittstoß, only because in 1440 in Krakow he created the famous high altar in the Marienkirche, 13 meters high and entirely carved from wood. Nicolaus Copernicus, the famous German astronomer, is now called Mikuláš Kopernik. He lived in Thorn, never spoke a word of Polish, and published his works in Latin. His ancestors were all Germans. The last names of the surviving Germans have been Polonized. Seligman, a name also common in the English-speaking world, would now be Swinty. No comparable phenomenon exists in Germany. Poles who immigrated to Germany generations ago still bear their Polish names, and nobody pressures them to change them. They are considered Germans, and they are. As chauvinist Musty's map shows, Polish chauvinism literally knows no bounds. The world went through the Second World War largely because of Poland and her taste for lands that belonged to others. Some of her aspirations she accomplished in 1945, but this map suggests that there may still be more to Polish desires. Even today's Czechia and Slovakia are on the list. As Adam Mickiewicz wrote, "But each of you has in his soul the seeds of the future rights and the extent of the future frontiers." War propaganda has obscured the true facts of history, otherwise Americans might realize that the German record is no more aggressive, if as aggressive, as that of the French, British, and Dutch who conquered huge empires in Asia and Africa while the Germans stayed at home composing music, studying philosophy, and listening to their poets. Not so long ago the Germans were, in fact, among the most peace-loving peoples of the world and might become so again, given a world in which it is possible to live in peace. Mistaken as the Böcklers of Germany may be in believing that concessions can be won from the Western powers by negotiation, their attitude proves the willingness of many Germans to trust a peaceful means to obtain their ends. Armament levels. Below are German and British armament levels for reference with expositional paragraphs. German armament levels. British armament levels. Soviet economics 1939 to 1945. The Soviet Union. While the German Reich in 1939 had 75 divisions, 1,000 operational aircraft, and 3,000 tanks at her disposal, the Soviet Union alone could boast, in the summer of 1939, that she could deploy at a moment's notice for the fight against Germany on her Western Front, 136 divisions, 5,000 medium and 261 heavy guns, 9,000 to 10,000 tanks, and more than 5,000 airplanes. 96. This was no mere showing off, the Soviet Union had formally volunteered these forces during the British-French-Russian military convention in July-August 1939 to the Western powers for immediate fighting against Germany, which also reveals a lot about the attitude of mind of the Soviets, who were undertaking the completion of the German-Soviet non-aggression pact at the same time, on 23 August 1939. Not because of the refusal by Britain or France, but mainly because of the Polish and the Romanian refusal to allow passage of the Red Army across their territory, did these negotiations founder, so that the enormous might of the Red Army did not go into action in Europe in the year 1939. That this offer of deployment of arms was proposed in earnest is also confirmed by Soviet historians. They affirm that the Soviet government during the whole course of the pre-war period was prepared to use armed force against Germany. 97. The Red Army had been vastly increased in recent months. The incorporation of reserve units in the Red Army in late 1938 had increased the Russian peacetime army to 2 million men, which was nearly triple the number of peacetime German soldiers. 98. During the years from 1934 to 1938, the Red Army had doubled their manpower and their fighting strength, according to a statement made by the former Soviet Defense Commissar Voroshilov on the 13th of March 1939. The vast USSR, the most militant country in the world, had for years been shifting the main emphasis of the industrial output onto the heavy and armaments industries, and already since the year 1937 was spending about 25% of the total Soviet national income on military purposes. 1939 to 1941. The Non-Aggression Pact. Hitler's decision to invade Russia developed through stages. The decisive stages were his orders on the 31st of July 1940 and on the 18th of December 1940 and on the 21st of June 1941. On the 31st of July 1940, he ordered a few of his generals to prepare an eventual campaign against Russia. On the 18th of December, he ordered the plans for the invasion. Operation Barbarossa. On the 21st of June 1941 came the definite and irrevocable instant order Dortmund, the war to begin early the next day. We shall follow these stages, which were not inevitable and not entirely foreseeable. Hitler himself arrived at them after considerable speculation. Russophobia, German expansion, and anti-communism, these, together with his Judeophobia, seem to have been the mainsprings of Hitler's political, social, ideological, and strategic thinking, driving him ahead. All of this is true, but perhaps not true enough. There was the proverbial Irish biddy, who, answering her neighbor's questions whether the gossip about the young widow at the end of the village was true, said, "It is not true but true enough." The historian, I think, ought to consider something like the opposite, that some things may be true but they are not true enough. That Hitler hated communists and communism is undeniable, but consider two caveats. In more than a few instances, Hitler said that his contempt for liberals and social democrats was greater than for communists of the working class. More important, he found in 1919 and often thereafter how well he could use the fear and hatred of communism for his own political purposes. Anti-communism was immensely popular in Bavaria and elsewhere in the world. He knew how to draw good profit from that. In sum, anti-communism was an important instrument of Hitler's statesmanship. The still almost universally accepted view of Hitler is that of a fanatic ideologue with demagogic talents, but one who ultimately courted disaster because he allowed his ideology to drive him beyond and beneath reason at the expense of normal political and diplomatic and military savvy. So far as his military command went, there were many instances when his generals, and they were among the best, if not the best, generals in the world at the time, were right and Hitler was wrong. But there were plenty of other instances, too, when he was right and his generals were wrong. And we must, albeit reluctantly, recognize that Hitler had, and demonstrated, not a few statesmanlike abilities. The first point of contention between National Socialist Germany and the USSR was involving the Balkans. The First World War had broken out in the Balkans, the Second World War did not. In 1914 the Balkans were the powder keg of Europe, but not in 1939. The Hitler-Stalin Pact divided the northeastern and central eastern portion of Europe between themselves, but not the southeast. Then, to Hitler's dismay, in October Mussolini upset matters by attacking Greece. The Greeks proved brave, fighting the Italians off, and Hitler knew that the British would profit from that. He had already attached Hungary and Romania to his three-power pact. There was now a mass of German troops in the latter country. He would now move into Bulgaria and make first Bulgaria and then Yugoslavia adhere to that pact and to the German alliance. Hitler would now move into Bulgaria and make first Bulgaria and then Yugoslavia adhere to that pact and to the German alliance system. The Russians, for more than one reason, insisted that at least Bulgaria should belong to their sphere. Hitler, already irritated by Molotov's harping on Bulgaria when in Berlin, paid no attention to that. The few Russian diplomatic protests concerning Bulgaria were dismissed as if they did not matter. On the 1st of March, the German army began moving into Bulgaria. April 5th arose another conflict between Russia and Germany. Hitler wanted Yugoslavia to join his tripartite pact. The Yugoslav government agreed, reluctantly. But then something occurred like a Serbian national uprising against the government, a coup d'etat nudged, abetted, and financed by the British. The new Yugoslav regime hoped to remain neutral, but Hitler reacted in an instant, ordering the invasion and the destruction of Yugoslavia. Again, he kept nothing secret about that. His powers of insight were significant. He said that while the British abetted the coup in Belgrade, the people in the Balkans thought that the Russians were behind it. In reality, the Russians had nothing to do with the coup. But then they thought they ought to make at least one small gesture. After all, they had divided northeastern Europe with the Germans, but in southeastern Europe had gotten nothing. Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, and now Yugoslavia, all of them in the German sphere, with Greece coming up. At 1 o'clock in the morning of the 6th of April, Stalin and Moscow signed a non-aggression treaty with Yugoslavia. The Yugoslav minister in Moscow, exhilarated, drove back to his residence at dawn, in the very hour when squadrons of the Luftwaffe rose from German airfields to pound Belgrade into ruins. Hitler writes a letter to Mussolini before the Order of Dortmund here, Deuce. I am writing this letter to you at a moment when months of anxious deliberation and continuous nerve-wracking are ending in the hardest decision of my life. Since I struggled through this decision, I again feel spiritually free. This partnership with the Soviet Union, in spite of the complete sincerity of the efforts to bring about a final conciliation, was nevertheless often irksome to me, for in some way or other it seemed to me to be a break with my whole origin, my concepts, and my former obligations. I am happy now to be relieved of these mental agonies. Stalin. Hitler remains more interesting and more extraordinary than Stalin. It's unfortunate so many writers and historians and biographers of Stalin fall back at defining him as a representative of extreme Marxism, a fanatic dogmatist who used every means for its cause. This is nonsense, or, at best, mere nonsense. Stalin's personality, his brutalities, were not those of a dogmatic Marxist but those of a Caucasian chieftain. In the early years of Hitler's ascent, when the power of Nazi Germany became a threat, Litvinov urged the League of Nations to make plans for collective resistance against Germany, and negotiated anti-German treaties with France and Czechoslovakia. The Western democracies' appeasement of Germany eventually prompted the Soviet leaders to change their policy and dismiss Litvinov, who was Jewish and closely identified with the anti-German position. Stalin had suspicions that Hitler's ultimate aim was to attack Russia. In 1939, he invited Lord Halifax, the British Foreign Secretary, to go to Russia to discuss an alliance against Germany. The British feared Russian communism, and they believed that the Russian army was too weak to be of any use against Hitler. In August 1939, with war in Poland looming, the British eventually sent a minor official called Reginald Ranfurly Plunkett. He traveled by slow boat, not by plane. He did not have authority to make any decisions, and had to refer every question back to London. The talks dragged on. The Russians asked if they could send troops into Poland if Hitler invaded. The British refused. The talks broke down. In August 1939, Hitler sent Ribbentrop, a senior Nazi, to Russia. He offered a Nazi-Soviet alliance. Russia and Germany would not go to war, but would divide Poland between them. Germany would allow Russia to annex Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. Stalin was under the impression Hitler was lying, but he did not trust the British either. The Munich Agreement had convinced him that Britain and France would never dare to go to war with Hitler. Of one matter we may be certain. This was Stalin's consistent distrust of the English. He saw them as prototypical imperialists and capitalists, worse than the Germans whom he respected. Stalin had two choices. If he made an alliance with Britain, he would end up fighting a war with Hitler over Poland. If he made an alliance with Germany, he would get half of Poland and time to prepare for the coming war with Germany. He chose the latter. On the 23rd of August 1939, he signed the pact with Hitler, changing the course of history forever. Conclusion. It seems to me the record is clear. Germany did not want war with Poland in 1939 nor a world war between the great powers. England, France, etc. The armament levels make it clear that the German military was preparing for a defensive war, not the brutal engagement that ended up happening. The World War was forced by the British on the Germans, with Poland being a useful idiot who had intense hatred for Germany since the Middle Ages. It is increasingly evident that Hitler did have plans to attack Russia, but again not as it happened in history. He only changed his mind after the failed non-aggression pact and the record in the Balkans. Hitler always knew he would eventually need the Lebensraum from Russia. That's why his attack on them was not an act of madness but of method and foresight. Hitler was not well focused in the Battle of Britain and left it to most of his cronies. He always thought that communism and Russia was the greater threat and planned his invasion of them extensively. So it is a surprise he lost at Stalingrad. I hope this documentary has been insightful and important for future historical events and purposes.